This is the gap that opened up when everything shut down. But entrepreneurs never stopped and found solutions that kept them going. At US Bank, we can help you adapt and evolve your business, no matter what you're facing. Because when you close the gap, a world of possibility opens. US Bank, we'll get there together.
And now, welcome U.S. Bank Assistant Vice President and today's moderator, Marcus Brown.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be joining you all, albeit virtual today, for what is going to be a great session. My name is Marcus Brown. I am Assistant Vice President of DEI Strategy at U.S. Bank, and I'm really excited to be joining you all as your moderator. One of the things that we really do care about at U.S. Bank is our recognition of our ability to work to help close the gaps between people and opportunity. And of that commitment is really rooted in our core values of putting people first. And we know that in today's topics, we'll really be understanding the ways in which the reality of COVID and other systemic issues have certainly impacted our small businesses and our communities and society at large. And I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit deeper today. But before we do, I'd like to just share with you some exciting news that we announced just last month at U.S. Bank, and that is part of our access commitment. We knew also, as we dived into this work, to best understand how we can address a lot of the opportunity gaps that exist across the country, is to recognize our role as a financial institution to be able to close gaps between people and opportunity and build wealth. And so with that, we announced our access commitment, which is truly focused on a long-term approach to supporting diverse communities in building wealth, starting with the Black community. And primarily, we recognize that because of that very prevalent data that exists around highlighting the 10-to-1 racial wealth gap. That is to say that the median wealth of a white family is $171,000 compared to that of a Black family at $17,100. And so with that in mind, we recognize that we have opportunity in front of us to bring our full core competencies of our business lines in partnership with our Community Development Corporation, as well as our Community and Social Responsibility Group, which encompasses our foundation, to truly meet our consumers and our community partners where they are. Part of that entails really supporting small businesses, being able to work with diverse suppliers, and truly understand the ways in which we can help connect with our customers in their journey to building financial wealth and to also establishing their legacy. With that said, I am proud to represent U.S. Bank today in joining this session and to bring to you all our amazing panelists. The first of which is Amy Liu, who's the Vice President and Director of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, and the Adeline M. and Alfred I. Johnson Chair in Urban and Metropolitan Policy. She's a national expert on cities and metropolitan areas. Liu is also adept at translating research and insights into action on the ground. As director of the Metropolitan Policy Program, which she co-founded in 1996, Liu pioneered the program's signature approach to state and local engagements, which uses rigorous research to inform strategies for economic growth and opportunity. Liu has worked directly on such strategies with scores of public, private, and philanthropic sector leaders in regions around the country, including Chicago, Detroit, Louisville, San Diego, and Birmingham, Alabama. Our second panelist who will be joining us is that of Faye Poet, serves as the president of Forward Cities, where she oversees organizational strategy and serves as the executive lead on the Iship Community Initiative. In addition, Faye is dedicated to advocating for the emerging profession of ecosystems building, and as a founding member of Ecosystems Unite. Beyond her formal role, however, she is sought after presenter as well as a trainer and thought leader on the topic of equitable entrepreneurial ecosystem building. Never one to be content with the status quo, Faye has also recently begun addressing a new need in local communities called ecosystem healing, which is around helping pivot ecosystems and institutions in this time of the dual COVID-19 and systemic racial injustice pandemics. So with that, I invite Mrs. Luce to join us to share a little bit more about her thoughts on this topic today.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, for that introduction. And I want to thank Patrice for giving me the opportunity to join the Main Street program. We are real excited to be partners to the Main Street America in our work. So the purpose of my talk is to provide a framework for all of you as leaders about how to rebuild better so your communities emerge from this pandemic more prosperous, more inclusive, and more sustainable. And as you all know, our nation, we are reflecting right now on how to emerge from multiple crises as a more perfect union, whether it's rebuilding public health, strengthening families and small businesses, acknowledging and rooting out systemic racism, adapting to environmental threats. These are objectives that members of the Main Street community can meaningfully contribute to. So how? So I want to start by at least describing what we mean by rebuild better. Now, last summer, we at Brookings offered this vision statement that local leaders can rebuild better by generating high quality jobs and wealth creation opportunities, including quality in placemaking, with an intentional effort to invest in Black and Latino or Native American communities as assets to a resilient economy. Now, to achieve this vision, there are 4 structural trends that we think you ought to keep in mind as you do so. First up, there's a deep demand for density in the knowledge economy, which means that cities, downtowns, and commercial corridors will continue to endure and thrive. So, as you know, COVID-19 has accelerated the rise of the digital economy. We've seen businesses large and small speed up their investments in touchless technologies, online platforms, virtual marketing, including the talent needed to excel in this environment. Now, to date, the digital economy has favored places with dense concentrations of talent, university R&D capabilities, quality places, and other knowledge assets. In fact, these 5 metropolitan areas have increased their market share of digital tech jobs in the last couple of years. And I don't really see COVID-19 or the rise of remote work really shifting this trend much, except for on the margins. Now, economic concentration, however, is also playing out within metropolitan areas. And our placemaking scholars examine the extent to which the rise of knowledge-based jobs have actually resulted in a demand for density or clustering at the neighborhood level inside metros. And what they found is absolutely yes. Over the last 10 years across all counties, as you can see in that blue line, what you see is a steady rise of job growth occurring in dense locations. That growth in job density, as you in this digital age, has certainly benefited core urban counties the most, yet mature and emerging suburbs have also seen gains in density. And as you know, job density is also good for the environment, creating more efficiency in our land and energy use while preserving open spaces and natural landscapes. Now, the benefits of economic concentration doesn't only matter to large metropolitan areas. In fact, smaller communities must also create critical mass to keep up with large cities. If you look at this chart, between 2001 and 2012, jobs in large, medium, and small metropolitan areas, and even small micropolitan areas, they generally rose and fell together. But since 2012, as the tech sector began to drive the US economy, the lines have diverged. Large metropolitan areas are pulling away from mid-sized and small metros, and all those metropolitan areas are faring better than small towns and rural areas. And as you can see, micropolitan areas and rural counties with economic assets or near other urban centers fare even better than isolated rural communities. So you may have heard from my colleague Ann Hannah Love earlier in this conference that density and proximity has also helped small businesses in rural areas and Main Streets better weather the recession. So in general, what you see is that the value of dense cluster development still matters today, which brings me to the next point, which is proximity is good for the office and commercial market. The industries that are most likely to cluster at the neighborhood level are fast-growing information sector, professional services, and management jobs, which in turn then attracts the clustering of retail and other local serving industries. In other words, there is market demand for innovation districts, retail districts, food districts, art districts, where economic activities are clustered together in vibrant, walkable places. What's also notable is that the demand for office space per worker has shrunk in recent years, which I think is a trend that will likely accelerate post-COVID as large tech companies and other employers shrink their office footprint or reimagine their spaces in preparation for a world where more people will work from home. Now, to me, this creates an opportunity to redevelop an entire network of downtowns, main streets, and neighborhood commercial corridors for the future of knowledge work and human collaboration. So when people are not working at home, they want to be in spaces where they can gather and collaborate. And furthermore, as more employers offer work from home options, local leaders should prepare to provide workers with options besides their own homes to do their jobs. Now, as we see vaccinations increase and public health risks become more manageable, workers may enjoy the flexibility to work in coffee shops, libraries, public parks, rented flex spaces. In short, the future community ought to provide more attractive public and private gathering places with accessible transit and affordable homes that continue to leverage the benefits of density in the knowledge economy. Now, as we ponder the future of the built environment, let's remember that not everyone in the community has the luxury to work from home. To me, the future city, the future local community needs to accommodate all workers. Now, as this chart on the left shows, the majority of the nation's highest income workers, that's 62%, they are able to work from home. But everybody else, not so much. And on the right, a high share of Black and Latino workers must report to a workplace to do their jobs. Many of them are essential workers employed in retail, logistics, the care industry. And people of color are also less likely to own a car than white households, although their car ownership rates have improved recently. Basically, in the long run, what I think is important is that we need to have employment centers connected by transit, multiple travel modes, or even shorter commutes, which is not only good for the economy, but it's good for equity and it's good for climate resilience. And finally, we have to acknowledge that Black communities have not benefited from the demand for density. You all know that small businesses make employment centers dynamic, hyper-local in character, and the source of wealth creation for local entrepreneurs. In the past year, due to consequences from the public health restrictions, we've seen about 1 in 5, 1 in 3 small businesses that have shuttered in most metropolitan areas. Now, of these small businesses, women and Black-owned businesses are least likely to survive, as we have learned from the last 2008 crash, which impacts family wealth. It impacts the key neighborhood commercial corridors in which these businesses anchor. And to further accentuate the spatial dimension of this chart from our friends at Economic Innovation Group, EIG, shows that more than half of the nation's small business recovery 5 years after the Great Recession took place in prosperous zip codes. That means the least advantaged zip codes lost businesses. So per my earlier charts, the demand for density, even by retailers, has not benefited all neighborhoods or submarkets in our communities. And on that point, if retailers demand density, majority Black neighborhoods have historically been overlooked by retailers. This bar chart, I know it's a little bit complicated to read, so let me walk through some of this for you. First, what you have to understand is each of those bars represent the average number of retail establishments by neighborhood income level. The left set of bars represents neighborhoods in which there are few Black residents, and the right set of bars represent majority Black neighborhoods. And the primary finding here is there are a lot more retail establishments on the left-hand side than on the right side, nearly double the number in some cases, no matter the income level. So the bottom line from this chart is that Black neighborhoods, even high-income Black neighborhoods, are penalized for their Blackness. So let me close with where I began. We have an opportunity to rebuild better, where the rise of new technologies is not a source of inequality, but a platform for expanded opportunity for all workers and for all communities, including being intentional about race and racial equity. Now, Main Street planners, community real estate developers all have a critical role to play. And I hope that my presentation shows that there is market demand for this future vision, where a network of dense, vibrant job centers and opportunity-rich communities can benefit all residents. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Amy. I really enjoyed the insightful presentation you provided, truly in providing more insight around transit-oriented neighborhoods, flexible work arrangements, and more intentional focus on supporting our small businesses. Next, I am excited to also have Ms. Faye Horwitz join and present as well a little bit more, pushing us to think about more systems level thinking and how we can approach that moving forward.
Thank you so much. My name is Faye Horwitz, and I am the president and CEO of Forward Cities. Forward Cities was founded in 2014, and we're a national nonprofit that equips community leaders with the strategies and tools they need to catalyze equitable and sustainable investment in the resources and support networks that entrepreneurs need to thrive. As an organization, we believe in equity for every entrepreneur. That's our vision. This idea that every entrepreneur should have an equitable opportunity and access to develop, launch, and grow a business that leads to personal, family, and or community thriving. So we're working around the country in a number of communities and regions. We also work in partnership with the Kauffman Foundation to do work related to their eShip Communities program. And that's really testing and codifying this new field of ecosystem building, which is how do you ensure that entrepreneurs have the best chance of success? And so how do you make sure they have all the resources, they understand where to go to get help all along their entrepreneurial journey? And our work is really rooted in this idea of systems change. And, you know, as we look to serve entrepreneurs just in general, there are three key ingredients for a thriving and equitable environment for entrepreneurs. Obviously, you need entrepreneurs. You need people who are ideating, creating. We need the makers, dreamers, and doers. And they need operating capital and market opportunities. And then you've got those folks that are supporting entrepreneurs. We call those folks equippers. And so they're the ones that provide entrepreneurs with the entrepreneurial education, the supports and different resources that they need to do their work and to grow, launch and grow their businesses. And then there's this third piece that actually is the connection between those two things. An entrepreneurial ecosystem is just like a natural or a nature ecosystem, and that is it's the full environment, all of the various people and resources and things that entrepreneur needs to thrive. And that includes the energy. So that flow of ideas, the flow of money, all of that typically is flowing naturally, right? And what you find is that just like in a nature ecosystem, when you have something that goes wrong, or when you have blockages, it prevents the ecosystem from functioning well. And so there can be barriers. And that's what happens in an ecosystem that is inequitable. And we see this with entrepreneurs of color and other entrepreneurs who have been disproportionately disenfranchised and underestimated. And typically that is entrepreneurs of color and indigenous populations and women as well. That also includes immigrant populations. So the work that we do is about how do we catalyze systems change? How do we heal the blockages? How do we remove them? How do we make sure that there's an equitable flow of resources from those that have them to the entrepreneurs that need them? And so what has happened to us in the past, year and a half as a country is that our ecosystem has been severely disrupted by a triple threat. And so we've got, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has raged across the country and the world. We have had a growing awareness of the racial injustices that have existed in our country for many, many years that have been really not addressed and dealt with in a way that provides sustainable change. And more folks are waking up to and understanding not only the disparities, but also how they impact us on an economic level. And then you've got the political unrest that is sort of burgeoning over the past year and just kept getting worse and worse to the point where we saw what we did this past January, which was extremely disturbing for our nation. So all of these things have created this scenario where we're living in this economic uncertainty, certainly a health uncertainty as well, but this trickles down to and has an impact on all of our economies, both on a national and a local level. So our cities are at a crossroads. There's no clear end of the pandemic in sight. There's no magic bullet for racism. And so there's only two places we can go from here. And that is either as we rebuild, we can go back to the way we were, back to the status quo, or we can choose to go towards something better. And so in order to do that, what we have to really look at where we are. This is not just an economic crisis. We have to look at the other things that led to the economic crisis. And what we're experiencing over the past year and a half and beyond, further into our history, is trauma. We are looking at and experiencing multi-layered and multifaceted trauma. And, this goes back to the roots of our nation. This idea of historical trauma is based on the fact that this collective experiences that we have of a particular people group that impacts their role in society. And America has had a repetitive pattern of historical trauma, with at least 4 people groups who have experienced it: Jewish Americans, recent immigrant refugee populations, Indigenous people, and Black Americans. We're also suffering from complex trauma, and that is an exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events over time. So often at the hands of what should be a trusted party. And so this can happen to an individual who has been, particularly a child who has been abused by a parent, but it can also happen to groups of people. So the enslavement and colonization of Black Americans is this kind of a trauma. It has created a cascading complex trauma over time, and continues to lead to re-traumatization that is extended the wounds of slavery far into the present. We've also, as a nation, suffered from chronic trauma. And that is, typically a repeated or prolonged or multi-layering of events. And so all the things that happened to us, to our nation over the course of last year, with first the pandemic and then the summer of unrest and the police brutality, the ongoing issues related to our political landscape and people not being able to vote, and what we saw in January related to the violence in our capital, all these things, closings of businesses, it's just layered, one thing after another, loss of jobs, the stock market, disruptions of our educational childcare systems, and all of this exacerbated for people of color who are already disenfranchised. And so you've got this national and this complex and chronic trauma, and then on top of that, this idea of a national trauma. As it's generally refers to this idea of members of a collective group, such as a country or other well-defined group of people. And this is what America has experienced just as a whole. So this is not even whether or not you're a person of color, we are all experiencing going through a national trauma. And these kinds of tragic experiences can collectively wound and threaten our national identity, which you've seen around the world and the way people are looking at us and the way we have handled these crises and or not. And that can often lead to division between various people groups. And you've seen that happening. You see that happening in our political landscape. You see that happening from a racial landscape. So these 4 types of traumas are things that we have to acknowledge we are all going through. It's not just about money. And so related to that, we have to think about how our cities and our main streets how can we address this? And in order to get through this together and become more resilient, we have to think about a trauma-informed approach. And so, often a trauma-informed approach is focused on these 3 things. We have to realize that the widespread trauma of what has happened and understand that what are the different ways that we can move towards a path to recovery. We have to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in ourselves, in our employees, in our businesses, in our children, this is something we haven't even begun to think about, right? What does that look like? And what does it look like in people that aren't like you? People are responding to this and living through this in very different ways, depending on their identity and who they were and what their business was before the pandemic. So we have to recognize those differences. And then we have to respond by fully integrating all of this knowledge into new policies, procedures, and practices for how we function, because this is not status quo. We can't just pretend like as soon as we're able to reopen from a policy standpoint that everything's going to go back to the way it was. It will not. And then the last thing is that we have to seek to resist re-traumatization, particularly for businesses of color. And one of the things that this looks like, for instance, is the way PPP was handled. and where PPP went to, which is to benefit the businesses and the individuals that were already okay before, but disproportionately not given to businesses that actually were in the roughest shape before, and then are struggling the most right now, which is businesses of color. And so that is an example of re-traumatization that we have to think about. So what do? We know this is the reality. What do we do about that? And, I began to think about this from a standpoint of triage. So if you have ever been in an emergency room environment, the way they handle cases that come in the door is they quickly assess where people are that come in, patients, and how severe their wounds are, and that determines where they funnel them. Do they stay in the emergency room? Do they go straight to surgery? Do they go to another department of the hospital? Do they go for testing? And this is what we have to do for our businesses and for our businesses on our main streets. We have to understand and meet them where they are with a triage approach. And we have to realize that it can be harder for business owners to recover and be resilient at this time because they are very unique. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, this actually comes from the bottom up, related to how do we become self-actualized as individuals. It starts with our physiological needs, making sure our physical needs are met. And then, are we safe? Do we have enough money? Do we have the resources? And what's our health? And then once we're able to make sure those things are taken care of, we move up to love and belonging and our relationships and friendships, and how do we engage with those around us. And that leads to, if we're able to do that, it leads to what's our self-esteem like? Our confidence, how are we functioning? Are we strong? Do we feel a sense of freedom and the ability to take care of ourselves and be whole? And that leads to self-actualization. What are the things we want to achieve? We have the desire to achieve, our passions, our goals. And what makes business owners and entrepreneurs unique is that they actually often are more driven to this self-actualization piece, even when some of the other things are not taken care of, because they actually use that self-actualization to drive the ability to achieve those other things. And what you see in the pandemic is that because this trauma has happened and because all these other things are much more threatened than normal, it is actually impacting entrepreneurs in a very unique way, because their whole way of being is breaking down. Their ability to self-actualize is disrupted because their businesses are closing. Their identity is tied to, in many ways, what they do and what they create. So they're struggling on this level, and that impacts their self-esteem. They don't feel like they're able to contribute to communities the way that allows them to lean into their strengths. They begin to feel like that they have little choices. Their confidence starts to be impacted. Their mental health starts to wane. And often we see entrepreneurs, particularly who have employees or have families that they work with as a part of their businesses, and they're often the income from those businesses are sort of caring financially for their families. And when that begins to break down, those relationships are strained. They're not able to pay for their employees. They have to let people go. They feel like that they can't take care of their family. And so these layered things are happening to entrepreneurs. And then, of course, safety. If you can't pay your bills, you can't keep your home, they're losing their places of business, they're losing their houses, they're having to relocate. Their health is suffering. We have these safety issues related to the pandemic that impacts businesses, and whether or not they can even be open for business at any given time. And it can change at any moment. And then that impacts, again, these physiological needs, right? You can't sleep, you can't eat, your whole world is disrupted, and you feel like just everything has fallen apart. And so we think about this, we have to think about how can we approach and work with entrepreneurs and businesses in a way that sees them as a whole being, the whole entrepreneur, rather than just whether or not their doors are open or whether or not they can reopen a business, or whether or not someone can start a new business during this time. And so we have to think about really leaning into providing supports top down for our entrepreneurs in our main streets to ensure that we're taking care of them so that their businesses can take care of us. And so I just urge folks to think about it from this perspective. Your main street is an ecosystem, and ecosystems are made up of humans. So in this time, find ways to be human. Figure out how we can move our cities forward together by seeing the whole entrepreneur and the whole business owner. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Faye. Just wonderful presentations, both Amy and Faye. I'm so excited to be able to join you all today on a panel discussion, really to kind of hit on some of these things. One of the things that I know was mentioned in both of y'all's presentations is really kind of thinking about these issues in terms of systems. And there are various levels to systems, and I think you all kind of made that very clear to us, you know, on the individual, to the community, to the societal level. And we have to really be thinking about it in that way as we think about solutions. But you mentioned something around the status quo, and then we're all going to have to really think about what our new normal looks like moving forward. And we often hear that, you know, perfection is the enemy of progress. And so I'm just curious if you all could share a little bit on how can local communities take a more agile approach, if you will, to contribute to the healing process.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, number one, the first thing that has to happen is we have to be listening to one another. We have to be actively listening. And that means asking folks what their experience is in this time. What are businesses actually living through, and not making assumptions and not making policy and procedural and legal decisions based on what we assume. So having open town halls with businesses, being able to do surveys, being able to have one-on-one interviews, and hey, just walk down the street and talk to businesses, talk to people, and see really where they are and what they need, I think is going to be crucial.
I would just add that systems is definitely, as Faye basically pointed to or implied, is it's behavior. It's not just policies and tactics and programs, it's behaviors and how we empower one another. So I would say one of the most important systems is being very intentional about who are the small businesses or leaders or nonprofit organizations we want to organize revitalization around, and making sure that our policies and our programs really are in service of what we hear from them, and making sure they really have the tools, resources, and partnerships to do the work, so they are not always by themselves on the margins, making it up on their own. And so I think part of the healing process is really being much more intentional in all those types of behaviors.
You know, I really love some of those responses that you shared, primarily in thinking about how we partner and how we're leveraging one another. And that kind of leads into one of my next questions, really, is when we think about this role of networks and, you know, collaborating more, particularly on a more regional or city or local level in this type of equitable recovery, what are some of the best ways in which those networks or collaboration could be leveraged? And I would love maybe some more specifics that you might be able to offer for folks who are looking to do some of that work.
Thank you, Marcus. I believe it's very important at this point to rethink actually how we collaborate. Often what happens is when you have a collaborative or even a cross-sector effort, it is led from the top down. And this idea of one entity being able to pick and choose who should be at the table for these conversations, who should be making decisions. And those that are most impacted by whatever solution they're attempting to sort of come up with are often the most left out of process and not invited to the table. And even there's a trend of saying, oh, well, we're going to talk to people first, and then we're going to take all that information, and then the people who are going to, with all the power, are going to get in the room, and we're going to make the decisions. And then we're going to share back out and say, hey, we heard you. Here's what we decided to do. And that is a typical government sort of listening process. And what we have to do is flip the script in this idea of saying, you know what? we have to shift the power dynamic, and make sure when we're creating tables that they're not created by those that actually have been a part of creating the disparities in the first place. That we are really designing new tables and allowing the idea of shared power, and making sure that the processes by which we are gathering information and making decisions are human-centered, and that they're led by, in many ways and as much as possible, those that are going to be impacted by the work. And so this idea of initiatives and roundtables being led by people of color, being led by women, being led by indigenous populations, I believe that's the key to making sure we are rebuilding better, and that we are creating new systems that work for everyone.
Marcus, I know that a lot of the Main Street partners work in both urban neighborhood corridors and also small town corridors and main streets, and each of them have different governing entities. So let me talk about networks in a couple of ways. I think one of the hardest things to do is to find the right networks that support inclusive placemaking, and to redevelop a series of neighborhoods in a transformational way requires community development, social services, economic development, infrastructure planning, and workforce development to all align towards the goals of the people and the businesses that make up that corridor. It's the most complex set of networks to have to manage. And sometimes I think a lot of our members who work in that sub-geography, it's not clear who owns those relationships, right? The governance of it. Sometimes you walk into a multi-neighborhood setting and there's multiple nonprofits and multiple intermediaries that do one part of that network really well. And because sometimes that governance isn't shared or it's clear, that's how we get top down, right? The city comes in and says, I'll take care of it. And what we need to figure out is how do we create a set of intermediaries at that neighborhood level, corridor level, Main Street level, that really has the platform and tools to bring everyone together around this complexity, and that they have the capacity, the rules, the authority, to be really community oriented. So I hope that, I think those are probably themes that are being covered by the conference, but there's no doubt we need all of these networks to work in service of the organizations, the small businesses, and the residents of those corridors. The issue is who leads. And, I hope that that's something that we can continue to be very intentional about versus disempowering people in the process.
Absolutely. And, a couple of things that I'd like to pull out from what you both have kind of shared. It reminds me, I have to say, one of the biggest lessons I learned in my community organizing days is our definition of power. And power truly is organized money and organized people. And what you all are getting at is thinking about how are we leveraging our collective power through these networks. And I would dare to call it a coalition, if you will, where people understand what their position is in the landscape and their contributions to this shared effort, whether it be through aligned interests or aligned values, but they understand their contributions to it and can ultimately have a collective impact as a result. And so I really appreciate, again, how you're driving us to think about this in much broader terms, but also still even more specifically in terms of some of the tactical activations of that. A lot of this work, as you mentioned, is complex. And for some of us, it may be new and unfamiliar territory. And again, we kind of go back into this process of how do we take these iterative approaches, but also how do we do so in a way that is being accountable to those in which we are truly seeking to be in support of. And so I'm curious if you could share a little bit, as local leaders or community leaders are thinking about this, how can they hold themselves accountable to ensure that they're not using time as an excuse for why things aren't happening or other constraints that may exist, but are also thinking about ways, how can they look to measure whether they're being accountable to the stakeholders in which they're actually seeking to support. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
You had to ask her the tough question, right?
So I'm letting Faye always go first.
Oh, this is the one I don't know I want to go first on. So I would say that accountability has been and continues to be the hardest factor in this work. It's very easy for people to say what they believe and what they would like to see happen, and I think that it's we want to believe the best in our leaders, that they do want these things to happen. I think what tends to happen is that there's a certain level of bureaucracy and a history of how things work that often gets in the way of progress and change. And then they're able to, if something doesn't happen or doesn't work or change doesn't come, they're able to lean back on and say, well, that's just not the way we do things. And that's not the way things are done. Or this process is going to take time. This is not going to happen overnight. And they can always fall back on that, right? So what I think is probably I think the accountability has to come from the citizens. I think we have to hold people accountable. And what that looks like is much of what we saw over the past year, which is people standing up and going, no, that is not acceptable. No, this cannot happen in my community. There needs to be people being willing to protest if necessary, but also to do things that are going to activate change in a more practical way. So being able to show up at city council meetings in organized fashion, and being able to request new types of activities, new types of outlays of funds that we haven't before. Being able to present creative ideas for how particularly the stimulus money is going to be spent. This is huge, right? We have communities all around the country, many of which are actually doing okay economically, interestingly enough, related to in terms of government budgets. And so they're about to get millions of dollars from the federal government to spend towards economic recovery into businesses. And it is up to us, the people that live in these communities, to tell our elected officials, this is how you need to be spending this money. And we need to be coming up with concrete solutions. We need to be collecting best practices from around the country, presenting ideas, taking them to those that have a seat at the table to ensure that this stimulus is spent in an equitable way that really addresses some of our systemic issues. So I would put it on us, to be honest.
And so I would say Faye's absolutely right, that community leaders need to hold everybody else accountable. I'm just going to complement that by saying that the people who have been in traditional positions of power ought to also hold themselves accountable. And I do know, Marcus, you're at US Bank. I've been very appreciative that there's a whole new group of financial institutions and corporations that have been very serious about their commitments to racial equity and trying to change behavior towards their investments, their partnerships, their capital, their business relationships, and so on. And the issue is, how do we make sure those commitments really do result in change? And so, I want to see, for these neighborhoods, we do need finance, we need market actors to really believe, as I said, the promise and the market opportunities in all of these places. And all those banks and larger corporations who might be, for vendor relationships or supply chains, they need to see the opportunities, but they first need to diversify themselves. I find developers And banks and corporations still have a lot of work to do to reflect the diversity of the communities they serve. So once they themselves, their leadership team, their management teams are more diverse, they'll forge different relationships. They'll start to have different products and services that reflect what their customers want. So they have to start with themselves, and then they have to check to what extent are my investments improving, what share of them are improving Black and brown or underserved populations, to what percentage of my procurement really serving Black and brown, Latino, Native American, women-owned businesses. And what can we do then to move the dial on this in a meaningful way? To me, it ought to show up in markets and in market investments and not just subsidies, because I think what we need is to create real economic wealth creating opportunities for the businesses, the residents, and the places in this larger economy. That's what we are in the middle of our economic recovery, and we do need market solutions, obviously supported by public policy, but in the end of the day, we need markets and wealth to work that have long been, again, discriminated against many of these communities that have enormous amount of assets.
Yeah, I'll also add to that, Amy, I'm glad you talked about this idea of sort of the market opportunities and, these market-based solutions. And I think that there's something there as well about how do we keep money in these communities?
Oh,
right?
yes.
How do we keep them not leaking back out into this land of the rich?
Yep. And you know what, Faye? We just put out a report. Our Bass Center did this around community investment trusts. And, it's the opposite of what we're seeing with opportunity zones, which benefits urban and rural places.
Exactly.
It's very top down. It's very investor centric, where the outcomes is return to investors versus does the investment actually down to the benefit of local residents and local nonprofits and local community development organizations. And what we're seeing now is a rise in community investment trusts. We're hoping that we have a federal government that may consider scaling this. But what we have is banks and philanthropy basically putting together REITs with local residents that put in, $25, $50 a month. And over time, they get a return on the investment in a commercial corridor, a new retail center that supports their communities. And what we love about the examples we've seen is when residents invest in the redevelopment themselves, they frequent those small businesses. They go to that eatery. They will, they'll support those shops, which makes those businesses do better, which then makes a return on their investment, and they get a dividend back. And I just want to make sure that the market opportunities that come from all the redevelopment that's going to happen out of COVID, right? Because we do have emaciated commercial corridors, is that they redound to local residents. My biggest fear is we're going to have a huge swooping in of large investments into these neighborhoods where we are going to lose the opportunity to keep the wealth in those communities. So I'm so glad you raised it, because it's a huge opportunity right now.
Most definitely. We're ideating on this idea of a actually something we're thinking about calling a marketplace concept. And this idea that government is doing a set aside of stimulus funds that are given to businesses not as cash, but as credits for them to spend on other businesses and with nonprofits that are led by other people of color. So really being able to keep the funds in a way that are circulating within a community, and it doesn't leak, right? And it has the potential to grow. Yeah. That is it. For us, that's the kind of creative thinking we believe that our governments need to be doing right now.
And Mark, is just going back to my presentation, I just think that with downtowns rethinking where they're going, I actually think there's going to be a redistribution of work and investment throughout our cities and metropolitan areas, which then actually creates an opportunity for us to create a set of redevelopments that push back against the history of segregation in so many of these places, that we can reinvest in certain parts of the neighborhoods again. And so to me, it's this window that we have to, as you said, Marcus, get our behaviors, get our systems, get our networks to quickly readjust and adapt to this new reality, new opportunity.
Yeah, well, I mean, you all hit on so many great things within that, and it actually kind of already segued into what was going to be my next question. When you're thinking about how do we even look to what the barometer of success is, right? And so as I'm hearing you all talk, obviously having a very meaningful touch point with stakeholders or anchor institutions who are part of your work is going to be really important to help you define what, we may refer to as KPIs or key performance indicators, right? Yeah. But one of the things that I'm hearing also is this shift from just simply measuring outputs, right? We can talk about, well, we created this amount of, affordable housing or was able to support this number of businesses, but then what are the outcomes? How has that stabilized community? How has that allowed for that community to be positioned, therefore, to be able to thrive? The other thing that I wanted to hit on is within what you all were kind of discussing is really, I would say, how do we also take what I was getting at earlier, this kind of agile approach, knowing that we won't be able to get, that as we think about an agile approach, if it's the case to get from point A to point B, we won't be able to give you that Tesla car immediately, right? We may have to start off with a skateboard, which is much better than you on foot, and eventually learn iteratively, right? And then you get the bicycle, the motorcycle, then the car.
I won't even get on.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well, nonetheless, maybe, the analogy may fall flat there, but, I often do kind of think about it too, as we talk about how people can readily have their on-ramps to the highway lanes of this work. And how are we, as leaders, as thought leaders and change agents, providing those on-ramps to the various lanes of the work? Because we all have a part to play. And that's what I really appreciate you all kind of surfacing here today. And the last thing I would say is that this focus on community, even more so having place-based and long-term commitments within communities, is going to also be a very telling sign of how well we can really push through what we are going through right now and be able to establish a new norm of systems that are more equitably designed to be able to support those who are most in need. So I just want to say thank you all for today's conversations, your thoughtful presentations and insights. And I know I learned a lot today, and I'm sure many of those who are participating with this workshop certainly learned a lot. So thank you both for your time.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and it was great to be with Faye.
It's been a pleasure to be in the conversation. This is how we rebuild better. It begins with this.
Absolutely.